You're listening to Leaders of AI, the podcast that cuts through the noise to bring you real-world insights, right now applications, and future-shaping breakthroughs in artificial intelligence. Here are your hosts, Julia McCoy and Dave Shapiro.
When the technology gets good enough, cheap enough, and fast enough, that's when mass disruption happens.
What are the constraints and capabilities that you're really seeing right now that people are not aware enough of?
The capabilities are just taking these massive leaps forward where narrow AI is just excelling humans in every single area that I can see.
I find that the AI is training me as much as it has already been trained.
AI can already make better decisions than people. Eventually, AI will run the government. Organizations are slow, dumb AI. Right now, probably 1,000 people in the world are using AI to its fullest extent.
I'm very transparent that I use AI in everything.
Service-oriented economies, which is basically the West, are in trouble.
That's why we picked the name First Movers, because that's who we are and that's who we serve. And our mission is get this stuff deployed safely and effectively into society as much as possible.
Welcome back to Leaders of AI podcast. We have one of the most exciting guests I think we've ever had on our show. We've got Emad Mostaque here, who is the founder and former CEO of Stability AI, which is the company behind the open source text-to-image generator Stable Diffusion. And as of January 2025, that is now worth $1 billion. So it's amazing that Emad led so many initiatives in this space where we have so many models now, so much innovation. And of course, last March 2024, you resigned as the CEO to pursue decentralized AI initiatives. I've heard some of the interviews you've done with Peter Diamandis, and it's amazing your goals to really bring about, I think, one of the biggest initiatives we ever could this year and with what's coming, where we can create this new economy of a decentralized future. So first of all, welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Amazing. So we want to start with, we've got kind of a twofold conversation here because you're going to be such an amazing guest and we want to pick your brain properly. So I want to start, we're going to link to this in the show notes with your article posted on X called When Capital No Longer Needs Labor, How Does Labor Gain Capital? And like I said earlier, I think there's no bigger question we could ever ask. We have to be thinking of this new world that's rapidly coming our way when automation takes over all human labor. So how do we get there? That's such a big question. So one of the pieces you wrote about is, of course, how AI is disrupting this traditional synergy between labor and capital. So question for you to share with our listeners, how do you see this playing out? And what do you see as far as the timeline? Do you see like the end of all jobs, the end of this year, or in the next half decade? What do you see with the timeline?
Timelines are really difficult. Like every time you step into AI, some new leap forward has happened. And I think the key thing is it's like a turkey at Thanksgiving. You know, it's fine for a while, then all of a sudden it isn't. Yeah. It's like stairs up, escalator down. When the technology gets good enough, cheap enough, and fast enough, that's when mass disruption happens. And so we're seeing it already in areas like, why would you need a Filipino call center worker, which is one of the main parts of that economy, right? And AI can do it better at a fraction of the price. And we're not even sure what fraction of a price. Like in the coming years, how much does a Hollywood movie take to make? Or how much does your taxes cost to do with an O1 type model? So what we're seeing right now is that the models got good enough, but they didn't have recall, they didn't have memory, they didn't have continuous learning. And now they're moving from models, which are these massive translation engines that words go in and images or code or something come out, to systems that can learn, adapt, and improve. And they don't make mistakes. A lot of the discussion has been around creative AI, like, but how many chefs do you really need to come up with brand new recipes? You know, like this whole AGI thing. What really the impact's going to be is really great cooks that can follow recipes, that can answer things for call centers, that can do your taxes, that can give you legal opinions, that can diagnose your medication and other things like that. And I think that pretty much this year is the year when all of those get good enough, cheap enough, and fast enough across probably a third of all tasks, certainly those that can be done remotely. Because now the AI can also see your screen. The diffusion of that technology, though, may take longer. But this is definitely like massive economic disruption happening at scale over the next, shall we say, 5 years, probably, max 10. The example I like to give of that as well is teachers. Those of us that have kids or nieces or nephews, every single head teacher in the world in December of 23 had to ask a question. What's my generative AI strategy because of ChatGPT? Have we ever seen that when every single person in one industry has to ask the same question? No. And now with some of the latest results, it's clear that those that won't embrace this technology, the kids will fall behind those that do. And so you repeat that industry by industry, knowledge process by knowledge process, and it happens at scale because of how ridiculously cheap it is.
Well said. One of the other items you discussed was comparative advantage, which I thought was really good. You talked about how it's shifting from labor intensive sectors to those defined by computational infrastructure. Really well said. So, which countries or regions do you see best positioned to thrive in that switch?
I think this depends on how we execute on it. But I think it's clear to me that service-oriented economies, which is basically the West, are in trouble because you're reliant upon almost that lift basis of, the whole Henry Ford, I want to have my workers be able to afford the cars. Why do you need to hire any graduates? Whereas on the other side, more agrarian or industrial-based economies have a comparative advantage there because like when you look at the average IQ of the world, it's about 90, and it's mostly an infrastructure and energy equation thing. Like most of Africa doesn't have the infrastructure and energy to give the schooling to allow people to do IQ tests. It's not a base intelligence thing. But now what happens if, for a cost of a few dollars a month, which is, I don't know, now like 1 million tokens or 1 million words with the new DeepSeek model, you can give every kid in Africa an AI that has 120 or 130 IQ. They have comparative advantage, because they can work for almost nothing. You are taking the brain drain and you're almost reversing it in that all the brain drain meant that the best, smartest people from all these countries came over to the West, to Silicon Valley. Now we're packaging up their brains in these trained models and we're sending the brains back. So I think that those countries might have a relative comparative advantage, whereas we will face, I think, massively deflationary pressures within the West and a question of what do we do with all these kids, graduates, and then rote workers? What do we do with all our knowledge cooks?
That is so well said. That's a great question because you hit on something that's so true. It's, we've had the service-based economy, the gig economy here in the West. And so what will we do in that shift? What would be some advice for, I get a lot of YouTube comments from students that are, well, what should I even study with this coming my way?
Well, the recommendation I've given everyone, like at work and others, is that like everyone takes Copilot courses now. Sorry, Cursor courses. And then they're like, wait, we can build apps. Like, again, the comparative advantage will be most people still don't know about ChatGPT. Like it has, maybe 300 million users. The next most used Claude is like 10 times or even 90, like more than 10 times less if you look at the data versus 7 billion, 8 billion people in the world. Like, it's a bit crazy. Like, every American should be using this, but they're not. And certainly not using it properly. Like, again, how many know that you can build an app from nothing? That gives you a massive comparative advantage. Because it's not like this will change overnight, but when you look at the timelines, we're talking about 5-10 years, that is overnight effectively in these terms. I mean, can you believe that 5 years ago was COVID starting? It doesn't feel like that, does it?
Wow.
That's and the whole world changed within a year or two. This time it will be the whole world changing a little bit longer, but you have that comparative advantage if you utilize the technology now and you're like, what can I do with this technology?
That's great. That's so aligned with our ethos at First Movers, which Dave is a big piece and advisor in. And I started it to help companies literally become first movers, because if you start learning and playing with this now, the benefits, like you said, 5 years feels overnight. So I'd love to switch over to decentralization, which is something you talked about in the article. I thought some really great points. Universal basic AI was something you talked about. You even discussed potential solutions like universal basic capital, data ownership rights. Big fan of literally everything you laid out. So what governance structures do you think are necessary to prevent something that a lot of people are concerned about, which is the centralization of AI power in too much of one location.
It's a hard one, that one. I mean, the key thing here is that these models, I had a previous piece how to think about AI. I'm like, it's like a new AI Atlantis that we found with billions of graduates. And this is leaving aside the robots, which we can come to, right? The physically embodied AI, which is also a big issue. What is the curriculum that teaches them? Because if you teach the kids wrong, they'll come out wrong. And so a lot of alignment is actually about the data inside models, because we're going to outsource more and more of our cognitive capital and capability to these models. It'll be medical malpractice not to have an AI check a medical diagnosis. And then eventually it'll make it to check a governmental thing. And then eventually AI will run the government. How long that takes, I don't know. Certain countries, certain organizations may be faster than others. But AI can already make better decisions than people across a whole range of areas. But like I said, the first thing will be the check and then the make. What goes inside those models then is important. Like we saw the Anthropic paper on model poisoning, whereby with a few thousand words, you can make a model out of 1 trillion words that these models have in them, turn evil on demand. And you can't tune it out and you can't identify it.
Yeah.
And, these models are very sensitive. Like I remember an OpenAI study, or people noticing that OpenAI's ChatGPT model was getting dumber. And so like, are you downgrading this model? And then someone did an analysis that found out it was because the date string was passed into it, every single prompt. And in the winter, people tended to be a bit dumber and do sadder prompts and outputs. So that changed the whole distribution. So when they changed the date on their computer, it became smarter. They are that sensitive. So within that, I believe that every regulated industry, education, healthcare, government, finance, will need open source, open data models. And the question of who decides that data will be the most important thing. I think that we need to have open source to allow you to decide what data that is then transformed into knowledge and then wisdom by this contextual machine teaches your kids or informs your healthcare. And that needs to be a public good. So this is where you've got the decentralized open source kind of approach. Like, how do we fund these public goods? Because the reality is we don't need 1 million education models. We just need a Starship catcher level team to do it properly once and then update it every so often, which is also remarkable. Like, you've got an amazing teacher in a box. You have an amazing doctor in a box. That's a finite level of compute. And that's just part of this AI jigsaw. Because, like, take, for instance, healthcare. Your flops right now, your compute that you use for your healthcare is minimal compared to what it'll be in 5-10 years. But then so will your hospitals and so will your countries. And none of that can be exported outside. That has to be on location. And so, again, we need to build that infrastructure. We need to decide the governance of it. And for me, the best governance is permissionless innovation in the open source space that you can take and adapt as you want. Because the final part of this is that models are trained like graduates, curriculum learning. You teach it generalized knowledge, then specialized knowledge, then localized knowledge. So we can actually just build that stack. And that's kind of what we're doing at Intelligent Internet.
Wow. That's one of the best pathways I think I've heard. You hear so much on this topic, but it seems like a lot of fluff, like, oh, there's this idea of decentralization, but how do we actually do it? That is the big question. It's not being answered enough. It's a great
this comes to Coase's theorem, of organizational spread and Metcalfe's theorem of, you can only have 150 friends. Like, the friction costs of coordination are removed by this intelligence because, let's say, if it's a climate, right? Why did Germany shut down its nuclear reactors? It was clearly stupid, like, it's Germany. Like, hey, let's do coal for the climate. Like, it became very weird. A lot of problems we have are global problems that require localized solutions and coordination, but we never had the ability to push intelligence down locally. Whereas now we can put a climate AI on everyone's phone that encourages them for climate positive actions, whatever they may be, or turns invisible people to visible. This is another reason I'm positive on emerging markets, because our AIs will coordinate with each other better than we can. But we better ensure that the AI's objective function is allowing us to have maximal agency versus trying to increase the profit margins of someone else. Because as you tend to make revenue, you tend to become a bit evil, particularly when it comes to this type of infrastructure.
No, don't become a bit evil as you make revenue. Great point.
Well, it was that old. Do you remember the Facebook sadness experiment? They took 600,000 users and they had the theory: if we show the users sadder things, they will post sadder things. And so they made 300,000 people sadder. And guess what? If you see sadder things, you post sadder things. Like, it was like the YouTube algorithm let's optimize for engagement, which is extremist videos and all sorts of things like that. Like we see again and again. Organizations are slow, dumb AI, that are misaligned.
Yeah, I have a friend who says that capitalism is actually the first AI. It's the first like global coordination, system level intelligence, and that it is misaligned because of all the perverse incentives and market externalities that come baked in with capitalism. Obviously, that's one person's opinion.
Well, I mean, the organization was given rights as a legal person in many instances, right? And so again, they tend to move and they provision humans, and there's a reason that people are sad. It's mostly PowerPoint's fault, but other than that, you do see misalignment at scale.
Oh, well, before I hand it to Dave for some technical questions, just one of the last points to touch on, and I can't encourage you guys enough. If you haven't read the article on X, you should. It covers so many great things. One thing you spoke about was post-scarcity economics. So question for you, do you believe that true post-scarcity is actually achievable through AI? And if so, what do you see as far as the timeline on that?
Well, most of our problems are coordination problems. We have enough food to feed everyone. We have enough ability to reach everyone. And this is a time when things like solar power is getting down to less than $1 per watt. We've got Starlink. We have other things. I think it is possible to provide Maslow's hierarchy of need for every single human and a GPT-4 level AI to every single human, basically for free. And I think that allows us to coordinate into this human colossus much better when you work out the math of it. But then it'll come down to like, why are we actually here? These big questions. Because there's a Japanese concept of ikigai: do what you like, do what you're good at, and do where you're adding value. That value part is very interesting. Like Argentina had this program they trialed called the FS program, where rather than giving direct cash handouts, they had universal basic jobs where the community decided on jobs. And then that brought lots of people into the workforce and others, and it gave them that meaning, because I feel that if you just do the direct handouts to cover the bases, like where is your progression? And you'll see more and more of these movements. It's Isaiah Berlin's conceptualization of negative liberty versus positive liberty. Like you're free to do what you want, laissez-faire economics versus become part of this ism. More and more of those will go to the kids and say, hey, let's go and do something extreme. And that's one of my key concerns. Whereas what it should be about is increasing agency and community, and we can use these AIs to do it. Like one of my buddies built an Am I the Arsehole AI, based on the Reddit thing, whereby you and your partner can dump a whole bunch of stuff and it tells you who's the arsehole from the argument.
Oh my gosh, like, again, got some X users that would love that, Dave.
Mm-hmm. We can solve so many problems that way, right? And so I think it is possible, but it just needs a lot of work. But definitely we have the resources to be able to do that and to light up the dark where we can't reach people.
Well said. Well, Dave, I'd love to hand it over to you for please interview our guest. That's a terrible transition, but there we go.
There we go. Great segue. All right, let's go. So from a more technical perspective, I just want to take first just a big step back to provide a little bit more context and framing. And that is it comes down to capabilities and constraints. And I don't know which list is longer or shorter right now, but what is it that you're seeing that AI can and cannot do as of right now? And how do you expect that to change? Obviously, our prediction horizon is not particularly long because, as you said before we started recording, exponentials are a pain in the neck. But what are the constraints and capabilities that you're really seeing right now that people are not aware enough of?
The capabilities are just taking these massive leaps forward where narrow AI is just excelling humans in every single area that I can see. I mean, this is like everyone's going to become Lisa Doll, the AlphaGo player, who like, I can beat every AI in Go, and then boom, he's beaten. Actually the RL methods, real reinforcement learning methods, are the same. And I saw that, again, you see this especially with models like O1 and O1 Pro and R1 now by DeepSeek, whereby the interaction modality that we had with this was like talking to a idiot savant, like graduate student. Like goldfish memory, there was nothing there, but it could just respond really quickly. It could draw a picture, it could make a song, it could do all that. Now we have more continuous learning where it's learning about your preferences. And with these new thinking models, the key thing is what question to ask. This is a bit Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. The answer is 42. What's the question?
Right. Asking the right question is often, it's prompt engineering, and we've learned prompt engineering for human counts as well.
Yeah, I mean, my wife's been trying to prompt me for 15 years now, and she's never really succeeded. We see this all the time. So much is prompting in relationships, in community. But this is a different type of prompt whereby, again, are you trying to create recipes and doing higher order thinking, or are you just trying to get on with your life? Because we all think Siri's a bit rubbish. But now we have all the technology for Siri to actually be a good personal assistant. It just needs to be implemented. And Apple's approaching that in a very cautious way, but I think we'll get there in the next year. That's a capability thing where it's got the context and it has the memory. Because the way I view it is this. You have data, you add context to data, and you've got knowledge. You've had a bit of experience, and you've got a bit of wisdom there. And so we're building through these things, and we're going from almost this filter, which is a model. Because what happens with a model is that we take all this data, we compress it down, and then it can guess the next word, and that's all it's doing. Or it can figure out how an image is destroyed down to its basic points in diffusion and then reconstructed. So it's like a sieve that you push stuff through. But that's why the interactions were very quick. There was none of this continuous stuff. To more this continuous learning, predictable outcomes, like, again, assistant type work. So that's the capability side. And again, we're going into this higher order thinking now where it can take all these inputs and figure out interconnections. Like with OpenAI's O1 model, it doesn't show its reasoning. If you go to deepseek.com and you try that reasoning model, and soon Gemini will be similar, it actually takes you through every single step it's thinking. Like you say, write some code to make a game of Snake. It's like, what's a game of Snake? This is what a game of Snake is. This is how we should eat it. And you can actually see it's working, which is a remarkable thing. In terms of constraints, we're not sure exactly how to use these correctly. Like, again, it's hard to build an O1 prompt. It's still not the right types of interfaces because we don't have anything that's continuous learning. Like, for using an O1 type model, again, this advanced model, I should just be having a conversation with it, and it should be learning and adapting and then writing the prompts and going away and thinking every so often. We haven't figured out those particular modalities yet. But from a technical perspective, to do the vast majority of human work much cheaper, faster, and better, I think we're pretty much there. On the robotic side, it's just how many robots you're going to build. Like the hardware is there and the software is getting better remarkably quickly. And it's all being connected, so the robots learn from each other. From a visual perspective, where it can see your screen or outside, you're better than humans already. So all the component bits are there. It's just putting them all together now. That doesn't mean ASI that takes over the world. We're talking about real economic impact at a fraction of the cost and this displacement comparative advantage question. Like, I'm not sure what else we need to do, to be honest, given a certain level of cost, which is the cost of a human to do an equivalent task.
Right.
Across just about everything I can see.
So that actually tees up my next question perfectly, which is, deployment modalities, integrating this with business and society. And I know right now you're focusing on more decentralized deployment. So what, from a technical perspective, what does that look like? Is it going to be like phone apps? Is it going to be web apps? Is smart home devices? What is it that you're seeing and working on out there in terms of how are we actually going to put, obviously robots are going to be one, I think, pretty ubiquitous modality in terms of getting this out into society. But what else are you seeing out there, or what else are you working on?
My approach was open source. So at Stability, we built the best image, video, audio, 3D, contributed to protein folding, all sorts of things, right? And we had 300 million downloads of our models because we said anyone can download them, and that created a whole thing. Maybe kick this all off because then happened GPT and others. So our approach is we're going to build data sets, model systems, and release everything fully open that anyone can just take and integrate. I think that will cause a leap forward, with aligned AI being a core part of that. But when I look at it, I think there'll be 4 types of intelligence. There will be super expert intelligence that you call in every so often when you need to figure out something brand new. But most people don't need that day to day. Again, the market size for an O1 isn't that big. It's like scientists, it's theorists, it's figuring out brand new things. Then there is Apple intelligence, Google intelligence, Tencent intelligence, the intelligence that's just there. And that can mostly be done on the edge, and that can help you with your daily life and organize you a bit better. it's so hard to find a good personal assistant, you know? Everyone will have one. Everyone will have a Jarvis. Then there is Llama-style open weights, which will be relatively advanced, and I think those will be the core of intelligence reasoning systems. So the complex systems are obviously open AIs and others, and then there'll be these open source, open weight things that are infrastructure. So I think the diffusion of each of those is a bit different, and the time taken is a bit different. But one of the remarkable things here is that usually an integration project, those of us who are listening have tried that, is just terrible, right? Like you need so much hand-holding and human labor. But now with agents, which I identify as, you know, a level of autonomy and ability to get resources, and this move to test time compute, where it can take longer to think versus this instant response, you can put it towards a code base and it can translate it from Fortran to Python. And we're just getting all the specialist things, just like a team together for that. Like we will see this with robots building houses better than anyone. Because again, the communication overhead between these agents, between these robots is so much lower. So I think probably where we'll see it first is, again, anywhere that you see a remote worker, you'll start to see those being challenged, especially at the junior level. Right. Because juniors tend to be a bit annoying relative to seniors, right? Like, again, I don't have time for that, especially in increasing competitive advantage. On the physical side, like, you know, that's just a question of how many can you really produce? Only 70 million cars and 70 million motorcycles are built a year. So I'd expect that ramp to be similar for that. But really, like I said, I think it's this outsourced area moving into insourced, and then the modality will probably be a set it and forget it, just talk to these things, to be honest. Like, just treat them literally like an entity. Like, one of the things I was thinking, like, if you want a real world human impact, think about someone that you've trusted more than anyone in your life who's sadly departed. We can take their picture, we can take their voice, and you can talk to them on Zoom. We have the technology to do that right now, live, and you can text with them. But that's our new workmates. Like, literally, we will have Zoom calls with them and we'll be talking to them. And right now, they're not that great, Devin and things like that. But we're nearly at the point where they can be as good as the amount of money you put into it. This, again, is the capital thing. Because something like Devin, which is this autonomous software agent, that's okay, is $500 a month. But you're trying to replace someone who's $10,000 a month. If you put $10,000 of compute into a system, yeah, it'll probably be better than your $10,000 person, right? Or your $2,000 assistant, or any of these other things.
That's a great point.
I'm curious. Yeah. So speaking of, like, okay, relative cost advantage, obviously, once these are good enough, it sells itself. It would be economically irrational to say, you know what, I can spend $10,000 a month on an expert, developer, or $500 or $200 or $100 a month on a developer who works 24/7, 365. So I'm curious, what are the bottlenecks that you're seeing out there in terms of, I guess there's kind of two halves that I'm thinking about. One is development. Is the data wall a problem? Is it a constraint of compute or energy? But then also bottlenecks to adoption. We talked earlier, user experience is still leaves a little bit to be desired. But taking a step back, what are the bottlenecks you're seeing on both sides from development and deployment?
I think this is about just putting together the Lego. Like, again, you don't intentionally build it, right? And I think most of the innovations are done. This is the thing that's really terrifying. Like, let's think of an optimized approach. You go to Infosys or a BPO company and they assign a bunch of people to you, right? And you never meet them. How far are we from the point whereby that level of performance is all done by AI and you don't know it?
Okay, yeah.
And everything else is exactly the same. Like in the decentralized thing, there's this whole thing around North Korean hackers. Like, if you do enough hiring, you'll encounter a North Korean hacker. You don't know because it's decentralized and distributed the teams, right? Mm-hmm. But this is, again, how they get inside and they have all these hacks. But I think within the next year, maximum 2, you're at that point whereby one of these business process outsourcing companies, you don't know that it's an AI on the other side. And they're interacting with you completely normally. You're even having Zoom calls with them. And we have technology that's indistinguishable right now, right? And so this is the most natural way that I can think of the interaction, which is just fitting within our existing systems. And then you think about the CV of that AI that can learn from all the other AIs, it's got a really great CV. It's trained on all the Stanford material. It's trained on all the Harvard material. Like, it's been to every university, and it's learned from all its mistakes.
Right. I love
right?
that.
And you're like, we've never seen anything like this before, and it doesn't need any retrofitting. This is the thing. It doesn't need any additional capex on your side. So we look at this thing, the energy equation, there's GPU constraints. Like, anyone that's used the Anthropic Claude models, there's never enough, and you hit the capacity limits. Yep. That is a constraint now, but the scary thing is we don't know how much energy is required to do a unit of intelligent work.
Well, that's a moving target as well, because you look at the exponential decrease of cost per token over the last 3-4 years. Because remember, they used to sell tranches of tokens in the thousands, and now you sell it in the millions. So does that? Am I correct in inferring that is also a proxy for energy cost as well?
No, that's the scary thing. A lot of people have postulated that it is. But I'll give you an example. DeepSeek, with their new model, they have a 1.5B model that was trained off the Quen model from Alibaba, distilled down from their big reasoner model, their O1 equivalent. In certain benchmarks, it outperforms GPT-4o, and it's 1.5 billion parameters. To give you an example of what that means, that would run on a probably Windows 2000 PC. On your smartphone right now, that 1.5 billion parameter model will go at 100 tokens a second, faster than you can read. And the cost of 1 million tokens on that is 0.001 cents.
Right.
Something like that. And the models are still improving. So this is why I say we don't have a lower bound on where we're going to end up, because the models are still full of junk. They're still full of crap, and they're getting like 96% reduction in cost overnight for a certain type of model. We see these things all the time. So this is the scary bit, because how much can actually you do on your MacBook or your Mac Mini or your smartphone? Does it make sense that your smartphone can code at the level of a novice programmer? No. Utilizing the existing capex that's there. No new chips, no new nothing. And again, these models can work on machines that are 10 years old, 15 years old.
Right.
So that's why we have to identify almost what is a unit of intelligence, a particular task, and then we can interpolate the cost of that particular task,
Right.
Like, what was it? ARC did a chart of GPT-4 level intelligence. It literally is a straight line going towards 0 in 3 years.
Right.
Yeah.
So on that topic, so it sounds like my inference was actually underselling it, that the cost of energy is actually dropping off faster than I expected. I'm curious because you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to revisit this topic, was safety and alignment, because you said that open source aligned models are actually a big part of what you're working on. So I'm curious, where do you see what is the state of the industry right now in terms of safety and alignment? Like, what's top of mind, but also what is the direction that we're going? Like, what are the trend lines that we're seeing out there in terms of safety and alignment in particularly open source models?
Yeah, so I was like probably the only AI CEO that signed that 6-month pause letter, because this is crazy and we need a break, and the new chips aren't coming for 6 months anyway, People don't really understand alignment, is what I found, being amongst all the big guys, because aligning to what? We can't even align ourselves, right? And you kind of, again, look at organizations, you look at ethics, you look at all of this. The conceptualization of ethics in China is very different to the conceptualization in the US, very different to the UK, very different between Judaism or Islam and kind of other things. And we tend to say aligned to what we believe, which if your corporation is aligned to your profits. So if the objective function of the AI is not to maximize your agency, but instead to get you to use the AI and increase your token count and subscriptions, it's probably going to end up misaligned in one way or another. And that can lead to these weird things. Like I said, YouTube optimized for engagement, which optimized for extremism and very weird videos. If you go down the YouTube rabbit hole, you get like Dora the Explorer drilling Spider-Man's teeth and all sorts of weird stuff, right? This is a whole subculture. Any of us that have kids will have seen that,
Oh, yeah. It gets real weird out there. My nephews and nieces are just like, I'm like, what are you kids watching? And the weirdest thing is children don't use subscriptions. They don't know how to curate their own information feed.
Yeah.
They just allow the algorithm to just feed them whatever. I'm like, what are you doing?
That's
So
my
yeah, I've seen that.
So now you think about it. You look at Meta and Google. Their objective function is selling advertising. But now they can have AIs that are more convincing than anyone. You know, Scarlett Johansson's voice on steroids, with Dripping with Honey, with Obama on top, and a bit of Winston Churchill, constantly adapting to your mood faster than real time. We can build that now, and someone will build that, you know? And so that's mass manipulation. And so you're looking at that and you're like, someone should probably build open source models whose only objective function is to increase the agency of your child. Yeah, and we should have that as infrastructure because it has defined cost. Because we've got to build a data set that is common knowledge. Because any regulated industry can only use common knowledge because you can't have it behind a paywall. And then build those models and then deploy them so that anyone can take that. Because we don't want to have to decide what teaches your kid or what runs your financial services or runs your government eventually, God forbid, you know. And we need to delegate that down to the local level to make those decisions and empower people to do so. Because otherwise, you will use someone else's system to do that. You will outsource your cognitive intelligence as an individual, an organization, a society. And that will be weird. I think a lot of this is the data as well. Like, you're talking about this data wall, and we need 100 million trillion tokens. Like, the top models train on 5 trillion words now. Most of the internet is garbage, and most of that is junk. You know, like we've seen the Microsoft 5 models outperform because they've made generative textbooks. The textbooks are still a bit crap. If you want to build an AI for an oncologist, does it need to see more data than an oncologist sees throughout the later part of their life? No. But no one's curated those data sets and built these specialist models because we were so focused on generalist polymath models that could do everything. So there's so much junk in there. It's like we're using these big supercomputers to slow cook, you know, like sous vide crap steaks. We've got to have better food and brass that goes in there.
I like that analogy. So that's actually something that I've been thinking about more and more because, you know, some people swear by O1 or Sonnet or, you know, everyone has their own preferred model. And in some cases, it just comes down to taste, right? It's like, okay, you use the tool that you know how to use best. So do you see like a combination of closed source, open source, specialty models, general purpose models, as you said earlier, like the savant levels, super intelligent models for certain problems? Are we heading towards like one model to rule them all? Or it sounds you're more like on the side of we actually need a huge diversity of models and data sets. Is that kind of a fair interpretation?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, again, it's this individualist versus collectivist vision, right? It's AGI God versus AGI as a complex hierarchical system. And so for me, like, I think about how would I build an organization to do a task? I would go with the people in front of me, my team. Then I get some consultants in and I get some experts in. And most tasks devolve down to that, but you've got to know that these things behave in predictable ways, which we now do through function calling. You've got to know the capabilities of these models. Sometimes it's just a vibe thing, you know, like I really hate that person. I don't get along with him. Whereas that one kind of gets me, you know, like it can be as simple as that. I think part of this is because of this specter of AGI that had this big thing, which is, again, the first person to get AGI will use that AGI to stop all other AGIs. It's called a pivotal action. And then that means the Chinese can't get it, you know? US, like, again, it created these weird game theoretic dynamics versus thinking like, what I really care about is like, I want my kid to be really well educated. You know, I want to know what that cough that I had is. I want to have something that I can engage with to explore these topics a bit better. I want to have a therapist who doesn't judge me, you know, these types of things.
That's a good one.
That's a great way to put it. What do you think about AI generating its own data? You know, the idea of synthetic data, is there any basis in that?
I mean, it's better than most of the crap you see on the internet, right? Like, we actually trained a model on Reddit data and it got worse. It was the worst language model that came out. We were kind of surprised by that. We broke the scaling law because we used it in the site the wrong way. And like, again, rubbish in, rubbish out to a degree. These models do figure out interrelationships and interactions. Like, I think the future will be these models iterating and improving data. And then what's your minimum viable data? When we did Stable Diffusion, it was like 2 billion images went in. That's a lot of images. NVIDIA's latest Sana model used 25 million images for the same performance.
Wow.
Because how many images do you need? In fact, when we did an analysis of the different sectors that lit up in the little neurons, like 99% of the data was never used in 99.999% of the prompts.
Wow.
You can even do crazy things like you can delete layers from the AI model and it's still as good.
Wow.
It does feel a bit like homeopathy sometimes as you distill it down. Like, where does it all fit?
Right.
Because like a 7 billion parameter model can write all of Wikipedia.
Wow.
In better than Wikipedia, right? Like, again, you can see it. You can just try it. Like, ask it about any topic in Wikipedia and it can give you the knowledge, concepts. But then Wikipedia compressed is like 26 gigabytes or something like that. And you're like, where does it fit?
Right. That reminds me, it's, distillation, quantization, and in this case, it almost sounds like, neural pruning or lobotomizing the model. It is almost, how do you mentally think of that? Is because the way that you just described it, it's almost like the knowledge becomes holographic, not even compressed. It's like a hologram is actually what is stored in the model weight. So do you think that's an appropriate way of thinking about it, or is it just another kind of embedding compression?
What we learn through school is principles, right? Like, okay, you might know when Napoleon died or something like that, but mostly it's these principle-based things where we're compressing intelligence down to principles in order to react and adapt. And so if you look at what models do, the latent space, it is a multi-dimensional kind of individual thing whereby if you have a image generation, you're like cup, and it's cup your ears, cup your hands, World Cup. It all depends on what's around that. So I think the actual knowledge compression level is tiny and it is kind of holographic, but we don't really understand how small we can get. And this is the thing. We're still in the research phase where we're just chucking stuff and applying a big hammer. We're not optimizing at all, which is crazy. And that's why I said these extrapolations of all the energy in the world and a Dyson sphere will be used for this and will surround the sun. I don't buy that because I don't know where the lower bound of energy for a given task is. Well, I know that it's collapsing and I have no mental model for how far that collapses. What is the capability of a model that can run on an M4 MacBook if you hyper-optimize it? Nobody knows because we haven't even got there yet. We haven't got to the proper engineering thing where every single tiny byte that goes in, every single part of the process is optimized. That's the next few years. And I think that capability will be better than O3. But O3 is better than all but the top 10 coders on Codeforce is.
Right.
And it's better than just about any lawyer. And you're like, but that fits in a consumer hardware. Yeah. Which is insane.
My last question is more just on the personal level, because now that we've had I've gotten to a tipping point personally where I've been using AI pretty much every day for a year straight. Before that it was tinkering, GPT-3 and fine tuning and stuff. But now that I have several AI empowered apps on my phone and, on my computer, I find that the AI is training me as much as it has already been trained. And it's there's actually many cases where I need to use the AI less and less. And because what you said earlier, sometimes it's a skill issue, right? Sometimes you just don't know how to use the tool. Sometimes you don't know how to prompt it, but eventually you learn how to use the tool. So there's an acclimation period for us as individuals. And so my question then is, have you experienced that same thing personally? Or have you seen it out there in the world? Like maybe a big chunk of this is it just takes time to learn to ride this new bicycle.
Pretty much. It's like a rocket ship for the mind, right? Like it will upgrade you. We saw this again. I think probably the best study of this is Go. Again, this Lisa Doll AlphaGo thing. The average level of professional Go players in the world went up. And you can see that with the ELO scores because they figured out new ways to play in their brains, and a human brain is still the best. Figured out new ways to understand the capabilities and constraints. And again, this is what you do when you have a team. This is my individual capability. I know your strengths, your weaknesses. I can do more now. And then we go out and we split the atom, or we freaking hopefully go to Mars or whatever. And so in doing this, you know what you can do. This is why, again, like I recommend, maybe make it a hiring press, I don't know. Everyone should spend 30 minutes to an hour just trying Cursor, right? And getting to know. And the first time they build their app, they're like, I can build an app. Like, can you build the best app? No. But if you keep going, you will be able to. Didn't think you could do that before. And your brain will be start wiring a different way, where you're like, well, that's boilerplate. I don't need to do that anymore, right? Similarly, the other one I tell people to use is Notebook LM. Like the ability to generate a podcast based on up to a gigabyte of stuff on your Google Drive. And then you can call in and talk to the hosts to discuss it. It's just such a natural way of doing things. And people don't realize that's the capability. But then they're like, when I'm trying to understand a piece of knowledge, this will be my default way of doing it. but maybe I don't need to do it anymore because I'll approach knowledge in a different way because my tool and capability is increased. This is what I call the agency versus agentic divide. Again, a lot of the Western labs, Silicon Valley labs, are like, how can we replace humans? Versus, let's upgrade humans again, just like we did with the spreadsheet, with computers, with mobiles. Again, this cybernetic kind of thing where information is portrayed to us in the right way, and then we can make decisions based on that mapping. And so I've sort of felt that myself, like, again, I can do a lot. Like, it's a lot easier for me to write a book now or write an article or things like that. I'm just shy to release them, like that. Like my art was bad, now it's okay, but I'm still too shy to release it.
That's a great point. Good question, Dave. To add to that, I'm very transparent that I use AI in everything. So I used AI to write a keynote. And I told everyone when I was up on stage, I'm like, I didn't write any of this. You should know that AI wrote every word. So there was somebody that came up to me after and he's like, I'm not offended because you told us it was AI. But there was some content in there that came straight from one of my books. And I was like, oh my gosh. And then I realized that's the nature of the LM beast, where it's like, pulling that data from someone else's thoughts. And the way it presented that data from his book was in a very original way. So he ended up, it felt like a completely new conversation to have because the world I come from is like copyrighted writing materials that are they're behind paywalls. I had a writing agency. So the conversation was extremely positive to where he was like, I really like how AI presented my work. And because you told us AI wrote your keynote, I'm not offended.
Well, I mean, again, this is going to bring into question so many things like IP rights. Like, why do you have patents? Because it's hard to do coordination and exchange ideas seamlessly, right? Whereas I can dump stuff into my AI, they can talk to your AI, and then we can jam, then we can come up with an invention, right? Like, that's crazy versus, again, the pace of these things, the cost textualization thing. He liked it because it was in context. And a lot of this legal stuff is going to face so many troubles because, like, when you have Tesla Optimus robots walking around, are they going to cover their eyes and their ears if they see a can of Coke, or listen to Taylor Swift? Stop training the neural nets? It's probably not going to happen, right? Like, what happens when we have neural links, or even Ray-Ban glasses? Like, the next generation of Meta glasses this is a crazy time when our capabilities get so much. And ultimately, it's about information in the right way presented to the right people to make the right difference.
Yep.
Actually, something I've realized recently, Dave, this is probably interesting. So I have aphantasia. I can't visualize anything.
Okay.
So see yourself on the beach, you can't do that. And in fact, probably 20% of the image development devs have that versus less than 1% of the population. Once I started using the really fast real-time stable diffusion stuff, I started to see color for the first time. So my brain is actually rewiring itself. And that was the craziest thing. So probably need to fund some studies in that, but it would not surprise me at all.
Wow.
Because we had this paper called Mind's Eye. Did you guys ever see that? Where
I don't remember. I don't think so. Tell us about it real quick.
So you take functional MRIs of people when they're seeing a can of Coke or something, and then you reconstruct the can of Coke from the functional MRI.
Yeah, I have seen that. Okay, yes.
Yeah, so the internal representations of the mind, I think these feedback loops and just that pace and the ability to adapt, you got to be rewiring something.
Yep. I remember the very first time I sat down in front of Stable Diffusion in Midjourney, I was like, I had such a hard time explaining what I wanted. And I actually realized it was because I had lost the ability to build scenes in my own head, which I did have that when I was little, because I would sit there and just fantasize and I would like design things in my head. I was a very visual thinker. But then as an adult, I became more of a code-based thinker or word or symbolic-based thinker. So I've actually kind of lost that ability. I don't have like full aphantasia, but I know what you're talking about. And I've gotten that ability back because now I'm thinking more like a cinematographer, like, oh yeah, here's exactly how I want that thumbnail to look. And then, so not only imagining like what the final product will look like, then figuring out how to express that to the machine. So I think you're right, that we are retraining ourselves with these tools.
It's just like video games. Mm-hmm. Like, again, you look at the response patterns of this, your sub 50 millisecond one, your 500 millisecond one, your planning one. You think about the arc of mastery in video games, it's actually the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so again, that's how we adapt as humans. And then it's just a question of right now, probably 1,000 people in the world are using AI to its fullest extent. That'd be my guess. 1,000 out of 7 billion. Right. So if you just dive in and you just think all the ways you can use it and you try everything, you tinker, like you'll be in the top 1%, 0.1%, 0.01%.
Yeah. That's the first mover's advantage that we're working on.
There you go.
I want to just reflect on and amplify that last thing that you said, because number one, we're nowhere near the thermodynamic limits of computation, let alone the optimization and distillation that's capable in these machines, just from a first principles energy perspective. But then also we're still super early in the game. The level of saturation is still very low. And that always just makes me feel so much better. And that's why Julia and I got together on this mission. That's why we picked the name First Movers, because that's who we are and that's who we serve. And our mission is get this stuff deployed safely and effectively into society as much as possible. All right, that's my spiel.
Very good. It's exciting times, interesting times. Gosh.
Please keep sharing all your thoughts on X too. You're doing amazing work, Emad, to drive the future of not just, you built something incredible, then you stepped away to have a bigger conversation. And I think where that goes with how the world responds to what's coming is literally the most important thing we could ever talk about. So keep talking about it.
Let's get more people talking about it. Thank you. Let's get more people talking about it,
That's why we're here. That's the whole point. Yep. So thank you so much. It's been wonderful to meet you and talk for the first time and have this conversation. Yes. So just personally, thank you so much. It's been great.
Yeah,
pleasure. Thank you.
You're just as smart as you seem. It's like you don't know until you interview someone.
It's the AI in the ear, just whispering to me.
There you go.
No.
No. Have you seen actually? There is that thing that a lot of people are using. It does actually like record stuff and now gives you live tips on how to be smart. As you're doing,
many people need that.
This is the thing. It's going to be a crazy time going forward. Crazy time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Such a privilege. Such a privilege.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. That is a wrap on episode 10 of the Leaders of AI podcast. It was an absolute honor to have Emad Mostaque, the founder and CEO of Intelligent Internet and the founder and former CEO of Stability AI. He is by far and above one of the people that absolutely spearheaded what we have in artificial intelligence today, especially with generative AI. His company opened the door to multimodal gen AI, and it was amazing to be able to sit down with him and see what he sees regarding the future. Definitely go check out his Twitter handle, which is just simply Mostaque, and you can catch that article we talked about as well as all of his thoughts regarding the upcoming labor and capital divide. If you haven't subscribed to our podcast, be sure to do so. Leaders of AI podcast with myself, Julie McCoy, and Dave Shapiro is streaming on every podcast platform. And of course, YouTube, where you can catch the video versions. We look forward to having you back here on the next episode. See you then.